everyone. My name is Emily Omier, and today I'm going to talk with you about whether or not you should open source a particular piece of code. And my goal for this talk is just to give everyone a framework for figuring out whether or not that a particular piece of code would make a good open source project. And then also more generally, just to encourage everyone to think critically before creating an open source project. Creating an open source project, yes, it's just uploading something on GitHub, but I think that the open source community and ecosystem is stronger when open source projects are created really intentionally with a clear idea of what the goals are for both the organizational perspective and the individual perspective. And also, there's a really clear alignment between the person who's creating this project and the project. It's very clear that this is the right person to be creating this project. And also that the open source project really is genuinely needed and is creating value for people in the ecosystem. So let's dive in. What I have is essentially a series of questions that I think people need to ask themselves before starting an open source project, before making that upload. The first question that you need to ask yourself is, can you open source this code? And this is particularly applicable if you are creating some sort of software within an organization as part of your employment, and you're thinking about whether or not you should open source that particular code. Open source, we talk about it as, this groovy community, the open source ecosystem, creating awesome software. Yes, that's all true. But at the core, open source is a legal term, and it refers to whether or not you can use a piece of software without paying anything, without getting sued. So open source is fundamentally a legal concept. And particularly if you're creating this as part of your employment, you need to make sure that open sourcing the code passes muster. Now, in some cases, this could also be, a business question, because creating, some code is going to be business critical. It could be, your core product that you're thinking about open sourcing. Or it could be that, some people in the organization think of this particular piece of code, as this feature or whatever it is, as being really business critical, and others don't. Maybe you don't think that it's critical to the business, but other people do. So you have to be clear about whether or not you actually can open source this code. And that's going to involve talking to people. Unless, of course, this is just your fun open source project. In that case, you don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to get clearance from anybody. But in many cases, you do. You have to really have a conversation with other people in your organization about whether or not it is practical to open source this code, whether or not it's legal, etc. So once you have established that, yes, you are legally able to create this open source project and it's not going to harm the business in any way, you need to think about what are your goals. And to think about this in sort of two prongs. What are your personal goals and what are the organizational goals? If you are asking your company to allow you to open source this code and probably also to allow you to work on it during your work time, you need to make sure that they're going to get something out of it as well. On the other hand, you probably are going to have some personal goals as well, and you should be aware of both of those. So I wanted to walk through what some sort of common goals are that people will have. So the first one is to build collaboration between organizations. And you can almost think of this as a way to sort of expand your engineering team without actually hiring people. Usually this works when we're talking about something that's very low level, that's critical for everyone, possibly for every single company, possibly just for certain types of company. but isn't building a competitive advantage for anyone. So open telemetry is a really good example of a project that fits this bill. It's a collaboration between many organizations, in fact, some of whom are direct competitors, to build something that they all need, but nobody is getting a competitive advantage from. This is also really common if we're talking about security tools, compliance tools. Those are really common areas for collaboration between organizations to build something that everyone needs and is going to sort of move the whole industry forward. Another organization level goal, and possibly even personal goal, is to find people to hire. So to build your hiring pipeline. This is really common. It's probably the most common reason that organizations have for creating open source projects. Facebook is one of the highest profile company to talk about this, but this is very common and a very good way to get really highly skilled people in the pipeline and aware of your company and what you're doing. It might be that you are either in the process of building an open source startup or that you would like to do that. So maybe you're building an open source startup and that's your core business, right? So then in that case, the conversation is a little bit different. But maybe that's your personal goal. Maybe you would like to take this project that you're right now creating as part of your employment at, say a big company, but 2 or 3 years down the line, you would like to spin this out and create an open source project, an open source startup out of it. Another one is to test your hypothesis. This is really common in academic settings where you want other people to run your code and you want to figure out if it works in the same way for them as it does for you. This could also be really common in an ML setting. You want to ensure that the thing is working properly in other scenarios other than your own. And if this is the reason that you want to open source something, you're going to have very different requirements from your open source and very different goals. So one thing in particular is you're going to want lots of users, but you want 0 code contributors because the whole point is you want to get feedback on the thing as it is now. So another reason that companies create open source projects and that individuals create open source projects is to improve skills. So it could be to level up your entire engineering organization. It could just be to level yourself up. The theory here is that if you are developing in the open, you're going to you're going to follow best practices. People are going to see your code that's going to improve your code hygiene. And you're just in general going to get opportunities to do things that maybe you don't do on a regular basis. So this can be both on a personal level, you want to try to learn something new, or you want to improve your own skills, or it could be that you want to do this for your organization at large. You want everyone to sort of level up their engineering skills. And it could be a way to get a new job on a personal level. You could be creating an open source project that you want to be sort of a calling card to prove what it is that you can do. And then actually one more thing to note about improving your skills. One of the interesting things about open source projects is that while they are sort of fundamentally a part of engineering, there's a lot of things about open source projects that are not just writing code. So one of the ways that you could improve your skills, in addition to things like, improving your code hygiene, encouraging more people to follow best practices, would be picking up and honing community building skills, which can also be really important, both in a professional and personal level. Now, the last one is a very common reason that people would give for creating an open source project, and that's to have fun. This is totally valid, but if in fact your only goal is to have fun, be honest with yourself about that at the beginning. because you don't want to say, oh, I'm just doing this to have fun. And then, 2 years down the line, feel frustrated because actually, you feel like you haven't gotten an ROI, or you haven't actually gotten a new job. If your goal is to have fun, then have fun. Okay, so next, you need to figure out how this particular piece of code that you're thinking about open sourcing, how this potential project aligns with those goals that you've identified, because not every project is going to align with the goals. And the sort of common goals that I outlined were very general. You need to be even more specific, right? What if your organization needs to attract more Python developers? If that is the case, you need to make sure that the open source projects you're creating are targeted towards those specific type of developers that you need to attract. You don't want to have some unrelated project, that's about changing font colors or something like that, making your font colors sparkle or something. That's not going to allow you to attract the Python engineers that you want to. So you want to make sure that the project that you're creating is in line. You want to make sure it positions you personally or your organization, or ideally both, correctly, right? Position you as a great place to do really serious machine learning projects, for example, if that's what you need. So make sure that this project is representing your organization and representing you the way that you want it to. This is actually one of the reasons why people talk about open source as being a way to improve your skills, because you want to be putting your best foot forward. You want the code to be clean. You want to have good documentation. You want to follow best practices. You want it to be secure. You want it to respect people's privacy. So you want to have an open source project that is going to really put your best foot forward, and also align, if you are looking for a job, you want to make sure that the project that you're creating is representative of the type of work that you would like to be doing in the future. If you're just doing this to improve your skill set, you want to make sure you're really focusing on those skills that you're trying to improve. And, if your project is if you're anticipating the project being sort of the top of the funnel for your hiring pipeline, or for people who could potentially hire you, you want to make sure that it's really representing you how you want to be represented. So the next question is personal, and also your supervisor, your manager, has to have some input, and that's how much time can you commit. And if you're creating this project as part of your employment, you're going to want to have a conversation with your supervisor about how much time you can spend on this during your workday. And that's going to include some time that is not writing code, right? How much is it okay if you spend 2 hours a week answering questions in your Slack room? Is it okay if you use work time to organize an event? And you're also going to have that conversation to determine if this is going to, push some things off of your plate, or if you're going to just be expected to do it in addition to everything else that you're doing. Maybe that would be fine with you, but you need to figure that out ahead of time so that you can have reasonable expectations about how this is going to impact your workload. If you're doing this project on your personal time, then you also need to be really honest with yourself about how much time you're willing to commit, and you're willing and able to commit. And the sort of two prongs to how you think about this are how much time per week, but also, how long of a time period are you going to be able to commit to maintaining this project? if you're set to retire in 6 months and after retirement you don't want to do anything, you don't want to touch your open source projects, you just want to surf, then probably this isn't actually a good time to create an open source project. You should just sort of let it go because you're not going to be able to see it through long enough to really get any traction or to contribute something really meaningful to the community. People will come to depend on your open source project. And if you don't think through how much time you can commit at the beginning and whether or not you are willing to do that, it can really be harmful for the open source community because people will come to commit or come to depend on your project. And you could either feel obligated to continue maintaining it well past when you're willing to, and that could lead to burnout, or you could just abandon it, which really sort of leaves a lot of users out to dry. Okay, so the next question that I want people to ask themselves is your project really, truly unique? There are over 8 million open source projects on GitHub. They are not all unique. There's a lot of duplicate open source projects. Maybe they have small tweaks of differences, right? They're not absolute, identical duplicates, but they are largely the same. And you want to think about, really think critically. Is your project really unique? Does it provide a value to users that is different from everything else out there? And try to think about, when you think about the differences between your project or your potential project and others, ask yourself, does this difference really matter? Because not all differences really matter. And if you create a project, you invest tons of time in writing up documentation, you set up your Slack room, you do outreach, you try to set up events, you talk about your project, and it's kind of the same as other ones. You're going to really be honestly wasting your time and effort, and also wasting people's time, other people's time. So if your project is not really that unique, then you're better off spending your time and energy contributing to the projects that you would have created a competitor to. Now, go back to thinking about your goals, right? All of those goals, or most of them at least, you can get just as much mileage out of being really active in somebody else's community as in having your own community. So if you are trying to hire people for your team, for example, and you become very active, contributing back, answering questions in some other project, potentially even becoming a maintainer in the future, that can help you reach your goals just as quickly as creating your own project. And in fact, you'll end up getting a bigger bang for your buck. So don't create your own project just out of ego because you want to have a project that has your name on it and you want to have the title of as creator. If there's not really anything that's actually different that people really care about, don't create a new project. Just contribute to someone else's. Or alternatively, create some other project that really does have something that's a differentiator. All right. This is an important question. What does success look like? So let's go back to thinking about goals, right? When we think about goals, those are relatively broad, but I want you to sort of narrow that down and think in business language, what are the KPIs that you're looking at? So how do you know that you have reached success? If you are trying to improve your hiring pipeline, you need to know, does success look like hiring 2 new engineers, or does it look like hiring 100 more engineers? And this is because you're going to want to evaluate, is this open source project meeting your goals? And if it's not, right, a year from now, if you feel like you have not made any progress toward your goals, then you're going to want to evaluate, do you want to continue devoting your time to this open source project or not? So when you think about what success looks like, you want to have something that's really clear, ideally with numbers attached, so that you can determine, yes or no. You can easily answer yes or no. This was a success. This was not a success. Determining what success is going to look like is also really important when you start making the case internally for open sourcing your code. When you talk to, business leaders, when you talk to even your legal team, they might say like, oh, this sounds like a lot of effort. It's just going to be safer for us to keep this proprietary. No, let's not bother. But if you are able to say, no, the reason that we want to open source this is because we need to improve our hiring pipeline. And this initiative is going to be a success if we're able to hire 50 new people by January 1st. Well, that's really concrete, and that makes it a lot easier to sell other people on creating this open source project. And it's also good for you, because depending on what success looks like, you will act differently, you will manage the community different, and you will develop the project differently. So maybe your goal is to improve your skill set or your organization's skill set. Think about how you would measure that. How would you measure something like, oh, our team's adherence to best practices has improved? Well, how do you measure that? Maybe you wanted to get the new job. Then you can sort of say, yes, no, I got a new job, or I didn't. Maybe you wanted to have that cross-organizational collaboration. In that case, what you're really looking for is getting a bunch of code contributors. And maybe you don't care about how many users you have. You just want to get as many code contributors as possible. And then maybe it's something else. There's a lot of different success metrics that you could have. You just want to be aware of what they are for your particular situation. Okay, this last question. Too few people ask it. What is your end game? So what happens when your project is mature, or what happens when you're ready to move on? You're probably not, even if you've thought through how much time you can commit, it's probably not going to be a decade. And even if you originally thought that you were going to take a decade to devote to this project, things change. So you might have other plans, and you should think about, what are some of the outcomes for your open source project? One really good sort of end game or goal for an open source project is that it can be donated to a foundation. And in that case, the foundation takes over a lot of the burden of maintaining it, and the project is still going to be updated, and people who depend on it will not be left out to dry, which is really important. You could also have new maintainers. So if you think that one of the ways that you want to sort of find a way to exit the project is by recruiting new maintainers, then that means that actually from the beginning, you should probably think about, what does your contributor ladder look like? How are you encouraging people to go from users to being community members who are active, to contributing code, and from the code contributor, to being maintainer level contributor? What does that ladder look like? What are you doing to really nurture those relationships with people so that it's realistic that you could have new maintainers that would allow you to bow out? And then what about just, walking away? That's unfortunately what happens to a lot of open source projects, but hopefully not yours, because that's not really a good outcome for users of the project, or for the creator of the project either, especially because, like I said, people will, if your open source project is successful at all, people will come to rely on it. You don't want to leave those people out to dry. You also don't want to feel like you have to continue devoting time to the open source project past what you're really willing to do, because you feel that burden. So you should ask yourself, will you be able to let go emotionally? If you have created and nurtured an open source project, it can feel, like your baby, and you don't want to get so attached to it that you are not able to step away when you either have to or you should because you have other things going on professionally or personally, and you don't want to let this open source project push you to burnout. So think through what your end game is, and take the steps necessary to work towards it, even at the beginning, whether that's recruiting new maintainers or trying to find a foundation where the project could live. So the core question we came to answer is, should you open source that code? Unfortunately, we have not given a definitive answer that's going to work in every situation because it depends. It depends on so many factors, from your organization, what your organization's goals are, where that organization is, its relationship to open source, your personal situation, where you are in your life, where you are in your career, and then, of course, what the potential project is and how it fits in with all of those goals. I think the key is just to think critically so that you're not making, you're not open sourcing projects without thinking through whether or not it makes sense, whether or not you'll be able to commit to the long term, and whether or not the particular open source project is going to help you meet the goals that you have from open source. Thank you so much for listening. I, again, am Emily Omier. We do have time for questions, but before we get to them, I'll make a plug for my podcast, which is The Business of Open Source. You can find it wherever you find podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. You can check out my website. I write about open source and business. And also feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can reach out in either place. And now we have time for questions. Thank you.
There she is. Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Sorry for the too long presentation.
It happens. And as said, the full presentation will be available online. So if you're interested in seeing more, you absolutely can. And now we can throw to questions. So reminder to submit questions on the Slido app. And remember to select stage P1 when you're doing that, or else we will not see your question. So if we can... Do we have questions at the same time, or should I get my phone out so we can see them? Get my phone out so we can see them. Got it. All right. Let's have a look then. Okay. Sorry, normally they come up on the screen, so I was not expecting this. Okay, so we've got one question, and it said this might be covered later in your presentation anyway, but what are some of the reasons you see for not open sourcing code? What are like the most common reasons that you come across?
Yeah, so the first one is that okay, so I'm going to make an assumption that we're talking about something that's internal to a company. Oftentimes, you'll find that there's like institutional resistance, right? One person, usually the person who creates the project, wants to open source it, but can't because there's a bunch of red tape. And honestly, this is like what OSPOs are created to solve, is to create more of an easier path to open sourcing something and more of a clear guidelines for knowing whether or not your potential project is going to be eligible. So you don't waste a lot of time talking to people only to get turned down. So I would say that's the most common thing, is just there's no good mechanism for creating an open source project, getting it cleared by your legal team, determining that this isn't of strategic importance, and so it's not going to hurt the company to open source it. That's by far the biggest barrier. If it's just your project, I think it's more likely that your project you'll create the project when perhaps you shouldn't have, and you're not actually going to maintain it. That's a lot more likely to happen if it's just a side project.
Okay, great. Well, that was actually the only question we had, so I guess we can leave it there. But thank you so much for joining us live, and thank you to our audience as well. Can you please give her a round of applause? And thank you so much, Emily.